It was one of those peaceful mornings where everything seemed quiet, almost too quiet. I wasn't even home to enjoy it. I was miles away, busy with my own work, thinking my house was safe and untouched. Back in the neighborhood, however, something strange was unfolding. A large yellow bulldozer rolled slowly down the street, its engine rumbling deep like a warning growl. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, some even stepping out with phones in hand. At first, they thought it was for road work. But then, the driver didn't stop at the end of the block. He kept coming, right toward my property. What they didn't know, and what I didn't realize at that exact moment, was that my drone was hovering above my house. I'd left it on standby before my trip, set to run occasional security sweeps. It wasn't meant for anything dramatic, just a way to make sure no one messed with my yard or tried anything suspicious. That little precaution was about to become the most important decision I'd ever made. The bulldozer pulled into my driveway like it belonged there. A few men wearing safety vests and hard hats followed behind, looking way too comfortable for people who didn't own the place. They had clipboards, and they talked to each other in quick, sharp voices. I couldn't hear them, but the drone's camera caught everything. Every movement. Every glance toward my home. One of them pointed at the front door like he was calling a shot. Another guy walked to the side of the house, snapping pictures as if they were collecting evidence for something. Meanwhile, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was an automated alert, motion detected on the property. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was the mailman or a stray animal. But when I opened the live feed, my heart just stopped. There it was, my own driveway filled with construction equipment, strange men, and that massive bulldozer idling like a predator waiting for permission to attack. At first, I thought maybe they were at the wrong address. It had to be a mistake. No one told me about any scheduled work. I hadn't received a letter, an email, nothing. But then I spotted something in the corner of the drone's frame. A woman in a crisp blue blouse, arms crossed, sunglasses on, and that all-too-familiar smug smirk. She was the HOA president, and that meant trouble. She had always been the type to nitpick every little thing. Too many flowers in the front yard? Violation notice. Fence 1 inch taller than the limit? Warning letter. But this was on a whole other level. She stood there with her phone out, looking almost proud. Like this was something she'd been waiting to do for a long time. The drone tilted as it tracked the movement. One man signaled the bulldozer driver. The machine's blade lowered to the ground with a metallic screech, the kind of sound that makes your stomach twist. Dust puffed into the air as it edged closer to the house. My house. I don't remember breathing during those first few seconds. I just stared at the screen, my mind trying to process what was happening. Then something clicked. I hit the record button on my phone. The drone's feed wasn't just being saved to my device. It was also connected to a cloud service I'd set up for emergencies. And that cloud service had a secondary sharing option. Within seconds, the footage was streaming directly to a secure channel I'd once given access to a local police department for a completely different incident. I didn't even think about that setup when I left for my trip. But now, it meant the cops could see exactly what I was seeing. On the feed, one officer's voice crackled through, distant but urgent. They were asking where this was happening. The GPS coordinates from the drone were already being transmitted. I could hear the HOA president laughing with one of the workers. She had no idea that every smirk, every word, every destructive move was being documented in real time. Not just for me, but for the people who could actually stop her. The bulldozer roared louder, and the first chunks of siding splintered off as its blade pressed into the front wall. Pieces of my porch fell like matchsticks. The men moved quickly, almost too quickly, like they were trying to get the job done before anyone could stop them. The drone hovered steady, its little mechanical hum the only thing keeping me tethered to the scene. My phone kept buzzing. Police dispatch updates. Nearby units moving in. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, but I couldn't look away. Every second mattered now. Every frame of footage was one more nail in their coffin. And still, the HOA president stood there, smiling, as if she had just won some personal battle. She didn't know she was about to lose in a way she could never have imagined. The feed from the drone was crystal clear, every detail sharp enough to make my blood boil. I could see the bulldozer's blade grinding into the siding, chewing through the front porch like it was made of cardboard. The men moved with military precision, one giving hand signals, another hauling debris to the side, a third jotting notes on a clipboard. This wasn't a random mistake. They knew exactly what they were doing. And from the way the HOA president hovered nearby, It was obvious she was the one pulling the strings. The camera shifted slightly as the drone adjusted for better light, and I caught her leaning in toward one of the workers. She said something, then pointed toward my living room windows. The man nodded and climbed into the cab with the bulldozer operator. The engine growled louder, and the machine rolled forward with a sickening crunch, glass shattering like 1,000 tiny bells. My jaw clenched so hard I thought my teeth might crack. I wanted to shout, to scream through the phone as if somehow they could hear me, but all I could do was watch. And then in the lower corner of the screen, I saw flashing blue and red lights. My heart gave a small jolt. The police were close, closer than I expected. The HOA president didn't notice them yet. She was too busy pacing in front of the rubble, checking her phone, and smirking at the progress. A few neighbors had gathered across the street. Some were recording on their phones, others just staring in shock. One older man shook his head, muttering something to the woman next to him. You could see the disbelief in their faces. They all knew this wasn't normal. Suddenly, my phone buzzed again, an incoming call from a number I recognized. It was the police dispatcher. I answered instantly, putting it on speaker so I could keep watching the feed. "Sir, we have units on scene," the voice said calmly, though I could hear a sense of urgency underneath. "We're moving in now. Stay on the line." On the drone's feed, 2 patrol cars screeched to a stop right at the edge of my driveway. Doors flew open and officers stepped out, hands on their holsters, voices firm and commanding. The workers froze mid-motion, the bulldozer's engine still rumbling, but no longer moving forward. One officer pointed directly at the HOA president, his tone sharp and unmistakable. She looked caught off guard, her confident smirk faltering for the first time. She tried to talk over him, gesturing wildly toward my house, as if explaining some urgent, righteous cause. But the officer held up his hand, cutting her off. Another officer approached the bulldozer, signaling the driver to shut it down immediately. The machine's growl died into silence, leaving only the sound of the wind and distant voices. The workers exchanged nervous glances. One of them set down his clipboard and slowly backed away from the equipment. The drone caught every flicker of panic in their eyes, every twitch of uncertainty. These weren't people who expected to be stopped. The HOA president's voice finally came through faintly in the feed, something about code violations and unapproved structures. But her tone had shifted from smug to defensive. The officer stepped closer, his body language making it clear that whatever excuse she was giving wasn't cutting it. From my end, I could hear the dispatcher taking notes as I gave them my own account. How I'd received no notice, no warning, how I'd been out of town and only knew what was happening because of my drone. I told them the feed was recording everything, stored securely, and could be handed over as evidence. Back on screen, the tension was building. The HOA president crossed her arms tightly, her sunglasses now pushed up on her head, her eyes darting between the officers and the half-destroyed remains of my front porch. You could almost see the calculations running through her mind. How to spin this, how to turn it around before she ended up in serious trouble. One of the officers spoke into his radio, then motioned for her to step aside. She resisted for a moment, but when 2 more units pulled up, her posture shifted. She wasn't in control anymore. The bulldozer driver climbed down, wiping his hands on his vest, looking anywhere but at the police. A younger worker whispered something to him, and they both edged toward the street, as if hoping they could just disappear. But another officer intercepted them, asking for IDs. Through it all, the drone hovered silently above, a mechanical witness to every second. The irony was thick. While they thought they were acting without anyone watching, they were actually performing for the one audience they couldn't afford: the law. And yet, even as the police tightened their grip on the situation, I could feel the story wasn't over. The damage was done, and the HOA president still hadn't realized the full extent of what that drone footage could do to her. The real reckoning was only just beginning. From the drone's high angle, the scene looked like a frozen photograph. The bulldozer sat still, its blade buried halfway into my home, splinters and debris scattered like confetti across the yard. The workers stood in small clusters, speaking in low voices, casting uneasy glances at the police officers now moving between them. The HOA president lingered near the front of my driveway, her phone clutched tightly in one hand, her other hand resting on her hip in a stubborn pose. But her eyes betrayed her. The calm, smug expression she'd worn earlier was gone. The officers were methodical. One spoke to the bulldozer driver while another photographed the scene, snapping close-ups of the damaged siding, the shattered windows, and the fresh tire tracks carved into the lawn. Every time the camera's flash went off, the HOA president's shoulders stiffened. She knew those pictures weren't for a newsletter or some HOA report. They were for an investigation. My phone was still connected to the dispatcher, who was quietly updating me on what the officers were doing. She explained they'd be getting formal statements from everyone present, starting with the HOA president. I watched as one officer guided her toward the patrol car. She wasn't in handcuffs, not yet, but the shift in power was unmistakable. A few minutes earlier, she'd been the one giving orders. Now, she was answering questions. The neighbors were getting bolder too. At first, they'd stood at a distance, but now some of them had crossed the street to get a better view. A man in a baseball cap pointed toward the bulldozer and said something to an officer, his voice carrying just enough for the drone's mic to catch fragments. Words like, "no permission," and "she's been planning this." Another neighbor, a woman holding a toddler, stepped forward to show the police something on her phone. I could only imagine it was a video or photo she'd taken before the cops arrived. Meanwhile, the workers were being separated for questioning. The younger one looked especially nervous, shifting from foot to foot, glancing at the HOA president as if hoping she'd swoop in to save him. But she was too busy defending herself to notice. The bulldozer driver kept his head down, speaking in short, clipped sentences. The drone drifted slightly lower, giving me a closer look at the damage. My porch roof was caved in on one side, the front door hanging crooked on its hinges. Inside, I could see part of the living room wall had been torn open, exposing insulation and broken beams. It was like staring at an autopsy of my own home. Then, something happened that caught everyone's attention. One of the officers stepped away from the HOA president and spoke into his radio, his expression serious. Moments later, a third police vehicle arrived, this one unmarked. A plainclothes investigator stepped out, wearing a badge clipped to his belt. He walked straight past the crowd and toward the officer with the camera. The HOA president's eyes followed him, and I could see the flicker of worry deepen. She tried to step closer, maybe to overhear what was being said, but another officer gently steered her back. Whatever was happening now wasn't something she was going to control. The investigator took a long look at the bulldozer, then at the house, then at the workers. He asked a few quick questions, and the answers seemed to confirm whatever he'd suspected. He motioned toward the drone, pointing up at it in the sky. The officer nodded and spoke into his radio again. A minute later, the dispatcher on my line asked if I was willing to make the footage available immediately. I didn't hesitate. Through the feed, I saw the investigator glance down at his phone, likely receiving the live link. His eyebrows lifted slightly as he began watching. The HOA president noticed his reaction, and for the first time, she looked genuinely uncomfortable. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze darting between him and the wreckage. The neighbors had started whispering among themselves, their eyes fixed on her. She must have felt the weight of all those stares because she suddenly turned away, pretending to check her phone again. But her hands were trembling. Even from the drone's height, I could see it. The bulldozer sat silent now, its engine cold, but the damage it had caused screamed louder than any machine. The air felt heavy, like everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The HOA president stood alone in that driveway, surrounded by officers, neighbors, and the undeniable truth playing out on a tiny screen in a plainclothes investigator's hand. And still, she didn't seem to understand just how much trouble was about to land on her. The investigator didn't waste time. He spoke briefly to the officers, then walked straight toward the HOA president. The drone's camera caught her stiffen, her chin lifting like she was preparing for a fight. She tried to talk first, gesturing toward my house as if to justify everything. But the investigator didn't interrupt. He just let her keep going, his face unreadable. When she finally stopped, he pulled out his phone and turned the screen toward her. Even from the drone's altitude, I knew exactly what she was seeing. It was the live feed from my drone, replaying the moment her bulldozer first touched my home. The way she had smiled, the way she had pointed at my windows, the way she had given the signal. There was no mistaking her role. Her expression shifted in real time, confidence melting into shock, then into something closer to panic. She glanced around like she was trying to find a way out of this, but the only people around her now were officers, workers, and neighbors who had seen everything. The younger worker, the one who had looked nervous earlier, suddenly spoke up. The investigator turned toward him, listening intently. The worker gestured toward the HOA president, his voice gaining strength as he went on. It didn't take much guessing to figure out he was spilling details. How she'd ordered them here, what she'd told them, maybe even how much she'd paid. Every word seemed to make her shrink just a little more. The bulldozer driver shook his head, adding something of his own. His tone was gruff, but his body language screamed one thing. He wasn't taking the fall for this. Whatever protection she thought she had from the crew was dissolving right there in front of her. The investigator took notes, his pen moving fast. Then he looked back at her and said something that made her flinch. She stepped back, her hands tightening into fists at her sides. For the first time all day, she wasn't the one in control of the conversation. The neighbors had formed a loose semicircle by now, their phones still recording. Some of them looked almost satisfied, like they were watching justice being served right in the street. I recognized a few faces, people she'd probably clashed with before. They didn't have to say it out loud, but their eyes told the story. They'd been waiting for this moment. One officer moved toward the bulldozer, checking the serial numbers and taking photos of the operator's license. Another measured the damage to my lawn, noting the deep ruts and destroyed landscaping. Everything was being documented. Every splinter, every shard of glass, every inch of destruction. From my end of the call, the dispatcher told me this wasn't going to be handled like a simple property dispute. The fact that the demolition had started without permits, and that I had clear video evidence, meant criminal charges could be on the table. I just kept my eyes on the feed, my grip on the phone tightening as the scene unfolded. The HOA president tried one more time to defend herself. Her voice rose, her hands waving as if sheer volume could erase the facts. But the investigator didn't even argue. He simply showed her another clip, this one of her laughing with one of the workers right before the bulldozer's blade hit my front wall. That laughter seemed to echo in my head, even though the scene was silent from the drone's perspective. It was the kind of detail no one could talk their way out of. The younger worker looked at the ground, almost embarrassed now. The bulldozer driver crossed his arms, leaning against the machine like he was done with the whole thing. The neighbors kept filming, some whispering to each other about what might happen next. A few more police units arrived, and the sight of them seemed to drain the last bit of fight from her. She crossed her arms tightly, staring down at the asphalt. Whatever plan she'd had this morning had crumbled as quickly as my porch had under that bulldozer. Still, no one had left. The air was thick with anticipation, as if everyone knew the next few minutes were going to decide everything. The drone hovered above it all, recording every movement, every glance, every word. And though she didn't know it yet, each frame was locking her fate in place. The silence on the street was the kind that made every sound sharper. The crunch of boots on gravel. The faint hum of the drone's propellers. The soft creak of the bulldozer's metal as it cooled in the afternoon heat. No one was speaking now, not the workers, not the neighbors, not even the HOA president. She stood there in the middle of my driveway, her eyes fixed on the ground, as if staring hard enough could make this all disappear. But the police weren't going anywhere. The investigator was still flipping through footage on his phone, replaying certain moments, slowing them down, zooming in. From the way he was showing the clips to the officers beside him, I knew they were already piecing together a timeline, minute by minute, action by action. My drone had captured everything too perfectly for her to twist the story. One of the officers stepped toward her with a small notepad in hand. He began asking questions, his voice calm but firm. She answered in short bursts, trying to keep her tone even, but there was an edge there now, a nervous tremor she couldn't quite hide. Every time he wrote something down, her eyes darted toward the crowd of neighbors, as if she could feel their judgment. The younger worker, standing off to the side, kept glancing at the officers as if deciding whether to say more. Finally, he stepped forward, gesturing toward the HOA president again. His words came out faster this time, his hands moving in animated gestures. The officer listening to him nodded occasionally, jotting notes. From the drone's view, I could see the HOA president's reaction. Her head snapped toward him, eyes narrowing, her lips parting as if she was about to shout. But one of the officers held up a hand, stopping her before she could speak. She turned away, her face tight with anger and something else, fear. Then came the moment that changed the energy completely. Another unmarked car pulled up, and a man in a dark suit stepped out. He wasn't a uniformed officer, but the way the others acknowledged him made it clear he was someone important. He carried a slim black case, and when he opened it, I recognized the equipment, portable evidence scanners and data tools. He spoke briefly with the investigator, who pointed up at the drone. A minute later, the dispatcher on my line asked if I could authorize a direct file transfer from my drone's memory. I agreed instantly. The suit opened his laptop right there on the hood of a patrol car, connecting to the drone's feed in real time. The HOA president watched all of this, her arms still crossed tightly over her chest. But there was no hiding the way her shoulders slumped when she realized what was happening. They weren't just taking statements. They were locking down digital proof that she couldn't erase, twist, or bury in paperwork. The neighbors had inched closer now, some openly talking among themselves. Snippets drifted up to the drone's mic, words like "about time," "she's done this before," and "can't believe she thought she'd get away with it." Their faces told me they'd been on the receiving end of her authority before. Maybe not as extreme as this, but enough to recognize a pattern. The suit closed his laptop after a few minutes, handing it to the investigator. The two exchanged a few quiet words before the investigator walked back toward her. His pace was steady, deliberate, the kind that made everyone watching hold their breath. She lifted her chin again, trying to reclaim that old confidence, but it didn't quite work. The investigator spoke, and while I couldn't hear the exact words, the meaning was clear from her reaction. Her eyes widened slightly, her jaw tightened, and her stance shifted just a fraction, like she was bracing herself. The bulldozer driver stood in the background, leaning against the machine, arms folded. The younger worker had stepped back into the crowd of neighbors, no longer part of her inner circle. She was alone now, a lone figure in the middle of my driveway, the shadow of the drone stretching across her like a silent spotlight. I could see the scene from above, the officers in position, the crowd surrounding them, the destroyed front of my home yawning open like a wound. And in the center of it all was the woman who had set this entire chain of events in motion, finally starting to realize that the story was no longer hers to control. The man in the dark suit didn't leave after transferring the footage. Instead, he pulled a small folder from his case and handed it to the investigator. The papers inside looked official, forms, legal notices, maybe even warrants. The investigator flipped through them quickly, his expression tightening before he glanced back at the HOA president. From the drone's angle, it was like watching a predator slowly circle its prey. She tried to maintain her composure, brushing her hair back from her face, but her movements were too sharp, too deliberate. She was nervous, and everyone could see it. One officer approached the bulldozer driver again, this time holding what looked like a printed document. He pointed to a section on the page, then toward my house. The driver leaned closer, his brow furrowing, then shook his head and said something short. The officer made another note, stepping away. Meanwhile, the younger worker was speaking to the plainclothes investigator, gesturing wildly with his hands. He pointed to the HOA president several times, then toward the rubble of my front porch. His voice carried enough for the drone's mic to catch fragments. She said, "No one's home. Get it done today, fast." Each phrase was another nail in the coffin. The HOA president finally broke her silence. She turned toward the crowd of neighbors, her voice loud enough to carry over the low murmur of conversation. She started talking about unsafe structures and community safety, trying to frame herself as the hero in all of this. But it was too late for that. The neighbors weren't buying it. A few of them even called out, telling her they'd never seen a single safety notice on my property. Her face flushed, but she pressed on, aiming her words at the police now. She claimed she'd sent multiple notices, that she'd received no response, that she was forced to take action. But then the investigator raised a hand and asked her a question, one so pointed that her answer stalled in her throat. He showed her something on his phone, and the color drained from her face. That was when I realized what it must have been. The footage of her arriving with the crew, laughing and giving orders. The same footage the police now had in their possession, backed up, time-stamped, and tied directly to her. One of the officers began photographing the bulldozer in detail. Every angle, every marking, even the operator's controls. The driver just stood back, watching silently, knowing better than to interfere. The plainclothes investigator moved toward my house next, carefully stepping over debris as he peered inside through the broken front wall. He took several photos, his face unreadable, then returned to the group of officers. They spoke in hushed tones, but the HOA president's posture told me she could feel the tide turning completely against her. The younger worker edged farther into the crowd now, blending in with the neighbors. He no longer looked like part of her team, more like someone who wanted as much distance from her as possible. A woman in the crowd patted his shoulder, murmuring something I couldn't catch. Then came a moment that made my chest tighten. The investigator pointed toward my damaged living room and then to the HOA president, speaking directly to the officer with the notepad. The officer nodded, wrote something down, and then looked at her with an expression that wasn't friendly anymore. The wind picked up, rustling the trees and scattering small pieces of debris across the yard. The drone's camera stayed locked on her, catching every twitch of her jaw, every flicker of her eyes as she searched for a way out. One of the neighbors, a man in a dark green jacket, called out something about overstepping authority. The crowd murmured in agreement, and the HOA president shot him a glare sharp enough to cut glass. But it didn't matter. Her audience was gone. This wasn't her meeting, her rules, or her stage anymore. The officers stepped closer now, closing the gap. They weren't rushing, but their movements were precise, intentional. The plainclothes investigator kept his gaze fixed on her, the folder of paperwork still tucked under his arm. Whatever was written in those pages was about to collide with the reality she'd been trying so hard to control. The bulldozer loomed silently in the background, a hulking reminder of the damage already done. The wreckage of my home lay open to the world, exposed and undeniable. And above it all, the drone hovered like an unblinking witness, recording the moment where her carefully constructed power began to crumble, one silent second at a time. The sound of heavy engines filled the air before I could even see what was going on. Dust started drifting past my property line like a strange fog. I wasn't there in person, I was miles away, but my drone, which I'd left hovering on a slow patrol route, caught everything. Its camera zoomed in as a convoy of construction vehicles rolled up right to my driveway. They didn't hesitate. A massive bulldozer inched forward, its blade gleaming under the sun, and behind it, workers in safety vests waved their arms like they owned the place. The drone's feed streamed straight to my phone, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Through my headphones, I could hear the low rumble of the engine mixed with the crunch of gravel under those huge tires. They didn't knock. They didn't call. They didn't even pause to check if anyone was inside. The driver revved the bulldozer, then pushed forward, tearing into the front porch like it was made of paper. Pieces of wood splintered and flew in all directions. My drone tilted slightly as I maneuvered it to get a better angle. The live feed captured every plank snapping, every wall crumbling, every piece of my home collapsing into chaos. Meanwhile, I could see their faces. Some of them looked almost smug, others nervous. A few kept glancing around, maybe worried someone would stop them. But no one did. They probably thought I was out of town and wouldn't find out until it was all over. What they didn't know was that my drone was sending the footage straight to cloud storage and, thanks to a preset alert, straight to the police department. I had set it up months ago after some suspicious activity in the area. Now it was paying off in the most unexpected way. From the drone's perspective, the destruction looked unreal. One moment my house stood solid, the next it was just piles of debris. I could see my garden being crushed under the treads of a backhoe as it swung around like it was clearing a vacant lot. My fence, something I'd spent weeks building, was flattened in seconds. My workshop, where I'd kept tools and years of projects, folded in on itself like a cardboard box. And still no one stopped the machines. They moved with this awful certainty, like they were sure this was all completely justified. I tapped into the drone's microphone to record audio. That's when I caught snippets of conversation between the workers. One of them said something about finally clearing it out, and the HOA is going to love this. Another joked about how fast they could get it done before lunch. My blood boiled. This wasn't just a mistake, they were proud of it. The best part, my drone wasn't just quietly recording, it had a small speaker. I switched it on, and through the buzzing of machinery, my voice boomed down from above. "You are on live camera. The police are watching." The reaction was instant. The bulldozer stopped mid-push. Workers froze and looked up, shielding their eyes from the sun, trying to spot where my voice was coming from. Some backed away, others whispered in hurried tones, clearly unsettled. From my screen, I watched as one of the supervisors pulled out a phone and stepped aside, his face tense. He kept glancing at the drone as if it might swoop down on him. Still, the damage had already been done. Half the house was rubble, the yard was torn apart, and my belongings were buried under broken beams and shattered windows. Then, in the corner of my feed, I spotted flashing red and blue lights approaching. The police had arrived faster than I expected, their cars pulling up with sirens still wailing. The workers scattered a bit, some pretending to keep working, others slowly edging toward their trucks. My drone drifted higher, capturing the entire scene. The bulldozer idling, the police stepping out, hands on their belts, eyes scanning the wreckage. I didn't say another word through the speaker. I didn't need to. The footage spoke for itself, and the expression on the officer's face as he looked at the destruction told me everything I wanted to know. They understood something serious had gone down here, and the people responsible were standing right in front of them.